Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. I'm Jane Blocker, Associate Dean for Arts and Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to CLA, Time Past, Time Present, Time Future, our 150th Anniversary Faculty Celebration. As our 150th year approached, we asked our faculty to think about how they'd like to mark the milestone. This celebration is a result of their ideas, collaboration, and hard work. It promises to be a fascinating coming together of disciplines around the important questions that dominate our present moment and a showcase for the creativity, energy, inquiry, and innovation that will bring the future into being. One panel in this symposium includes faculty from Geography, Environment, and Society, and Classical and Near Eastern Studies, and another blends the disciplines of art and psychology. One looks at the future of academic research, another considers the role of design in a planet shaped by climate change. The next few days are organized to celebrate our community of scholars, artists, and performers who, through their own research and creative practices, as well as interdisciplinary efforts, are tackling many of the greatest challenges facing societies here in Minnesota and around the world. This 150th anniversary, with all of its related events, certainly makes it an exciting time to be on campus, but it is also an exciting time to be a scholar or artist in the liberal arts. There's never been a time when the contributions of the liberal arts are more relevant and necessary. Unfortunately, Dean Coleman is unable to join us today, but if he were here, he would likely say something along the lines of what he said at his State of the College address, and I'm quoting him. The research and the creative work that we do is very present in our day. It's very apparent to people. I always say, if you look at the front page of the newspaper or you look at the homepage on a news website, the liberal arts are all over that page. Whether it's talking about something related to art, whether it's something about economic policy, crime, education, achievement gaps, media and culture, international conflict, diversity and inclusion, or whatever it might be. All of that is us. That's the work that we do. We have an extremely strong case to make that we're doing the work. We are asking the kind of questions that are driving national discourse. Now, I would only add to that we not only have an urgent role to play in the present, we also participate in the work of envisioning, of imagining a different world from the one we currently inhabit, the work of creating emotional, physical, and intellectual refuge from what dominates the front page. In this regard, I'm reminded of what William Carlos Williams wrote in 1962. It is difficult to get the news from poems, he admitted, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found in them. So as we celebrate this 150th anniversary, let's remember that while we honor our legacy, we are also building the foundation of the future. While we celebrate the faculty and research of today, we are making plans for the faculty and disciplines of the next 5, 10, 15, and ultimately 150 years. As we face the road ahead, as we look across the chasm of the future and contemplate how to reach it, let us take courage and guidance from scholar and activist Gloria Anzaldúa, who writes, Caminante, no hay puentes, se hace puentes al andar. Voyager, there are no bridges. One builds them as one walks. 150 years is a significant milestone for any institution, and for the faculty here and across campus, this anniversary marks a century and a half of cutting-edge research and creativity and stellar instruction. 150 years of tackling the ever-changing challenges facing societies. 150 years of mentoring generations of scholars, artists, performers, entrepreneurs, and leaders of every kind. It is a remarkable legacy, one of which we should all be proud. Dean Coleman and I want to thank you for being part of that legacy, for working to transform the lives of our students and communities every day, and for building towards a strong institution in the years to come. Before I present our keynote speaker, I'd like to thank the planning committee who have so thoughtfully organized this celebration. Timothy Brennan from Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature, Bianette Castellanos for American Studies, Kate Derrickson, Geography, Environment, and Society, Sumant Gopinath from Music, Michal Kobialka from Theater, Arts, and Dance, Chris Larson in Art, Erica Lee, History, Matt McGew, psychology, and Gary Ohlert in statistics. And the co-chairs of the committee were John Freeman in political science, Ana Forcinito in Spanish and Portuguese, and Joni Smith in theater arts and dance. So let's recognize their work, please. With that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Michal Kobialka from the Department of Theater Arts and Dance. Excuse me. During the course of his academic career, Michal has published over 100 articles, essays, and reviews, as well as presented papers on medieval, 18th century, and contemporary European theater and theater historiography at various regional, national, and international conferences. He is the author, co-author, or editor of 6 renowned books exploring space, history, and historiography, and his current research agenda focuses on the examination of imperfections in the academic design for the 18th century and the Enlightenment, which continue to affect the Euro-American Academy. At the same time, he's involved in 2 other book-length research projects, a monograph called The History of Polish Theater, as well as in a 3-year and multi-site project called Staging Difficult Pasts of Narratives, Objects, and Public Memory. I should also note that Michal served as Associate Dean for Faculty at CLA from 2011 to 2014, a role for which I have greater admiration every day. Today he'll present a talk called The 150th Anniversary of CLA, A Challenge to the Archive. Welcome, Michal.
Thank you, Jane, for the introduction. I believe when you go to conferences, there is a joke that there is a paper between you and drinks. We have 150 years between you and the reception. I feel very privileged to be giving this keynote, which I would like to be about our past, our present, and our future in CLA. My focus is not going to be on enumerating our faculty's accomplishments. This can easily be done by CLA's Office of Institutional Advancement. Rather, I want to emphasize the faculty's extraordinary efforts to create a vital space for their intellectual endeavors and to develop a sense of autonomy freed from the operational imperatives of the college and the university. Likewise, I don't want to highlight how well we were doing in 1994 or 2005 or are doing now, but to gesture at how well we might still do despite our academic reality, our world contradicting itself. This keynote, thus, is not about the simulated images of the past or utopias, but about educated hope in the space of the now. I would like to begin with a quote from Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School philosopher. Quote, "Without this critique of experience, the students are deprived of the intellectual methods and tools which would enable them to comprehend and evaluate their society and its culture as a whole in the historical continuum in which this society fulfills, distorts, or denies its own possibilities and promises," end quote. So to begin, time passed. What we remember, how we remember, and why we remember what we remember have always been fraught with difficulty, or at least doubt. Returning to the classics, for example, we can find in Cicero's De Oratore, or Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, that the art of memory came into being with Simonides. The story goes that when Simonides had left an evening banquet, the entire building collapsed, bearing the remaining guests. The relatives of the dead who came to seek the bodies for burial were unable to identify the bodies because they had been mutilated to the point of being unrecognizable. Simonides was summoned. Because he remembered the order in which the guests had been sitting, he could help identify to each relative his or her own dead. The point, though, is that the legitimacy of his rememoration depended upon the use of a specific mnemonic lexicon and the practice of mnemotechnics in order to convey what narratives this process of representing conjures up and legitimizes. Nothing encapsulates this fraught nature of mnemotechnics better than the commemorative pamphlets celebrating the legacy of the College of Liberal Arts, established, depending on the selection of the point of commencement, either in 1868 or in 1869. That is a special edition of CLA Today celebrating the 125th anniversary of CLA in 1994, and a commemorative volume for the 135th anniversary of CLA published in 2005. I'm still looking for the documents marking the 25th, 50th, 75th, or 100th anniversary of CLA. What is that these documents tell us about the conditions in the college? In other words, how are they related to CLA's actual behavior? In her opening remarks on the occasion of the 125th anniversary of CLA, then Dean Julia Davis avers that the College of Science, Literature and Arts, and since 1963, the College of Liberal Arts, was established in 1869-70 primarily for the purpose of educating future academic leaders. She traced the shifts from an emphasis on the preparation of leaders in selected academic disciplines such as mathematics, geography, languages, history, and rhetoric, to the liberal education of men and women who were expected to turn their social intelligence into social leadership in the 1940s. Thus, the purpose of education was to teach students to become responsible citizens and active participants in the democratic process. The next stages were marked by the growth of students' population during the 1950s, as well as the demand for additional space, a more flexible curriculum, and more resources, legislative and federal, to carry out this mission. The decades of the 1960s and the 1970s consequently represented years of immense innovation in the College of Liberal Arts. In response to student demand, several new departments and programs were established, even though resources could not keep up with the demand. The 125th anniversary celebration in 1994 took place at the time of uncertainty about the future of higher education. Davis notes at the time, quote, "Much of what we do in liberal arts is not seen by the public as central to the needs of its citizens, nor to the solution of very real problems of society. We must renew our efforts to show the value of liberal education, the necessity for increased understanding of cultures other than our own, and the ability of citizens to be able to think and communicate about complex issues," end quote. With this in mind, the 125th celebration spotlighted some great teachers in CLA history, individuals whose names are engraved along Scholars' Walk. John Barrymore, Robert Penn, Mary Turpie, Malford Sibley, Arthur Naftalin, Catherine Nash, Walter Heller, Arthur Ballard, Donald Peterson, Dominic Argento. These were distinguished teachers and creative persons recognized by national awards and international academies and by committees rewarding disciplinary and interdisciplinary teaching. The 1994 special edition of CLA Today was a scrapbook of our past, 1869-1994. Here are some of the pictures: university leaders in 1917, Maria Sanford, the first female professor at the university in 1890, the men's 1916 soccer team, the women of Delta Gamma posing for a photograph in 1890, conscientious objectors participating in a K-ration study in 1944, Rosemary Freeman and Horace Huntley discussing strategy during the 1969 takeover of Murray Hall, the Office of Criminal Justice Studies vandalized in 1970 by Students for a Democratic Society, Students and police clash in a 1970 ROTC demonstration, an African dancer performing in the 1986 Martin Luther King concert, students staging anti-apartheid rally on the steps of Memorial Hall in 1986, and students in a coffee house with their laptops in 1994. As we move through this chronicle of the past, we can see this visual history in concert with the interviews with past deans, Everett McDiarmid, E.W. Zeeberth, Frank Soroff, Fred Luckerman. These are the time capsules. We read, quote, McDiarmid's tenure saw some social tinderboxes flare, pacifism, anti-communism, and the political activism tested the relationship between CLA and the university's central administration. Thus it is possible. Zeeberth witnessed repeated testing of democratic values in 1968, student takeover of university administration in a staged protest against the war in Vietnam. Soroff was instrumental in questioning the idea of relevance in determining what educational requirements would remain in effect or be abolished during reallocation of resources and reorganization of CLA. Luckerman brought to his deanship a history of active support for cultural pluralism, minority studies, and feminist concerns during Vietnam War protests, free speech demonstrations, and the general uproar in the 1960s and early 1970s. The 1994 special edition of CLA Today ends with a 32-one-page narratives about CLA departments and centers establishing their provenance in CLA, as well as academic and artistic contributions of CLA's liberal arts education. Indeed, and let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about. The 1935 anniversary of CLA, celebrating the legacy of the College of Liberal Arts, published in 2005, recounts 135 voices of notable CLA alumni sharing their stories of discovery and transformation during their years here on campus. Quote, the authors are scholars, lawyers, artists, media professionals, public servants, and entrepreneurs. They are leaders in education, business, government, healthcare, technology, and the arts. Together, they tell us that however much we have changed and continue to change, something important and fundamental endures, something to be preserved and celebrated. That something is the immeasurable value of a liberal arts education that prepares students not only for fulfilling careers, but also for lives lived fully, reflectively, and creatively. End quote. The stories recall moments in Walter Library, the Varsity Cafe, Al's Breakfast, Perrine's Bookstore, Memorial Stadium, the 16A bus, as well as the wars, the protests, and the events which to this day still haunt them. The 1925th and the 1935th anniversary of CLA offered two different ways of marking time. Two different ways of defining what constitutes the historical matter of CLA. This historical matter, describing the events and the people, was shaped and arranged in order to establish the representation of a present intelligibility in the 1994 and 2005, and to be housed or laid to rest in the commemorative archive, the archive. The French historian of everyday, Michel Desserteaux, defines the archive as a place that is produced by an identifiable group sharing a specifiable practice for organizing materials. With the help of analytical procedures and totalizing taxonomies, the archive aims at reconstructing objects from simulacra and scenarios. Somewhat differently, Michel Foucault conceptualized the archive as the law of what can be said, the general system that describes the appearance of statements as unique events which have their own duration, as a place of formation and transformation of statements and events. And in his way, the philosopher Jacques Derrida saw the archive as a juridical place where men and gods command with authority and social order is exercised through the interpretation of the law. If the idea of the law conveys something fixed and singular, ideas influenced by the uproar of 1968, such as Jean-François Lyotard's notion about an incredulity towards meta-narratives, the premise of a single or universal history had to make way for narratives and images that are projected from different, other points of view. From such a perspective, the last few decades have seen the emergence of feminist and lesbian studies, gay and queer studies, cultural and ethnic studies, and post-colonial and subaltern studies, all of which have engaged in the analysis of coercive and disciplining modes of representation stored in the archive. Their goal, to combat the erasures that a singular history or perspective enforces and recover the other, traditionally marginalized or silenced subject. Employing various strategies, they have re-examined dominant institutions of knowledge and power, both real and symbolic, which control, shape, and reproduce structures of belonging that defined what's worthy of being archived, how it is going to be archived, where it is going to be archived in order to maintain a particular visibility of that event or object. As evidenced by the documents associated with the 1925th and 1935th anniversary of Cla, I'm confronted with practices which perpetuate the regime that promotes a contemplative attitude towards the object and the past. They place the object along the narrative itinerary which produced the past and justified the present nostalgic desire for the archive and for the return to the most archaic and place of absolute commencement. What happens when the contemplative attitude towards the object is abandoned in order for us to become conscious of the critical constellation in which precisely this fragment of the past finds itself in precisely this moment? What happens when the epic element is replaced with a constructive element, the fragment, directed towards a consciousness which questions the continuum of normative history? What then is the reality of these fragments, which the commemorative celebrations in 1994 and 2005 held to be irrelevant or not worthy of record? Today, they came back on the edges of discourse and murmur words which have different historical depths, are bracketed by multiple temporalities, and reveal the tension between the past and the present imaginations and intelligibilities. Consider the following. In 1924, President Lotus Kaufman appointed a commission of 7 to plan the future educational mission of both the state secondary school system and the University of Minnesota. He believed in the centrality of education to the future development of the citizens and of the state. The committee compiled extensive demographic data, in part drawn from the 1920 census, to advance a commitment to create equal opportunity for all students who enter the university regardless of class or geographic location. However, as Mark Soderstrom noted in his dissertation on science and segregation at the University of Minnesota in the first half of the 20th century, the committee used the 1920 census data for its report selectively and simply excluded the state's entire African-American population of almost 10,000 people. African-Americans were a larger percent of the population than several ethnic groups which were included. Neither President Kaufman nor the committee envisioned the state's African-American citizens as a group who would be central to the future and the growth of the state. It would be no surprise, then, that President Kaufman became the architect of racially segregated, taxpayer-funded student dormitories and cottages from 1931 until his death in 1938. African American students had access to the classrooms and university events, Kaufman explained in a 1931 letter to the head of the NAACP. Social separation between them and white students, however, was the bedrock of university life and was, he declared, entirely wholesome. The files marked Negro and Jew in the papers of university presidents and deans of students included documents that monitored freshman students' physicals specifically for the enrollment of African American and Jewish students. Out-of-state students' housing needs were assessed with special attention of how many of these students were African Americans. Counting out-of-the-state Jewish students included a special category for New York Jews who the administration likely feared for their radicalism. Edward Nicholson, who became the first dean of student affairs in 1917, believed that his job required him to limit student rights. As dean of student affairs, he decided, for example, which student organizations were politically acceptable, what information was propaganda and could not be circulated, and who on the student staff of the Minnesota Daily exercised undue influence. He sought secretly to influence Minnesota politics and gave information to a Republican politician who helped build a case that the University of Minnesota was invaded by communists, and its faculty and students were taking direct orders from the Soviet Union. Nicholson not only passed the names of those faculty and students to the Ray Chase Institute, but to FBI as well. This paradox that racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism were deeply embedded in a vision for a public education and the liberal arts was at the core of the 2017 exhibition at the Anderson Library, A Campus Divided. Thus, what earlier we celebrated our collective past and looked to them for models offered by professional custodians of the past who had sought to ground identity through objective accounts of the way it actually was, as Leopold von Ranke would have it. Today, we appear to regret much of our remembered past, displaying an ever-growing willingness to apologize and to disavow. Ours is a guilty age, pervaded by ethics of responsibility and by a sense that we have much to atone for. Today we are cognizant of other fragments of our constellation. The early struggle about the identity of the university, the conflict between the classicists and the radical scientists. William Shaper's dismissal in 1917 for his views regarding the US participation in World War I. The closure of Foolscap, which in December 1917 published a long editorial on academic freedom, exposing the instructors who followed prescribed orders in interpreting their subjects. David Swenson's 1919-1920 Academic Freedom Report, providing in the post-war hysteria a firm and effective statement of the inalienable rights of teachers. Benjamin Lippincott's efforts to establish tenure at the University of Minnesota. The fight against the 1927 bill presented to the Senate and the House, which would have made it illegal for a teacher in any tax-supported school of Minnesota, quote, to teach that man either descended from or ascended from a lower order of animals, end quote. Langton Hughes's commencement speech and an attack on him in Are They Communists or Cat Pose. The visit of the Nazi ambassador, Hans Luther, in 1935. The use of radio as a new technology, a new Chautauqua technique, offering an extension courses in miniature, whose fundamental purpose was to reconcile the ways of higher education to the people of the state. The names of all African American activists who participated in the fight leading to the end of segregated campus housing implemented by acting President Guy Stanton Ford in 1938. Student radicalism in the 1920s, 1930s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, including the most recent clash between the administration and whose diversity in 2015. The imposition of the Student Code of Conduct approved by the Board of Regents on July 10, 1970, after the students' disquiet earlier that year. The creation of African American and African studies, as well as American Indian studies and women's studies in 1969. Indeed, without this critique, the students are deprived of the intellectual tools which would enable them to comprehend and evaluate their society and its culture as a whole in the historical continuum in which this society fulfills, distorts, or denies its own possibilities and promises. This academic year, the Institute for Advanced Studies will be offering year-long series to examine the impact of the 1968-69 events on the university and the college. I can only hope that we will move beyond the flaws and imperfections of our past presidents, provosts, and deans towards the discussion of how they have come into being, how they have been rationalized, and what power they have secured in the past, and whose consequences and operational strategies are felt even today. This critique of experience is also a critique of the vagaries of what constitutes liberal education at the University of Minnesota. When and why certain disciplines are subtracted from or added to its curriculum, how and by whom it is funded, what defined its purpose and goals, and for whom it is offered. Some of the answers can be found in the documents already quoted, CLA Today, celebrating the 125th anniversary of CLA, and a pamphlet commemorating 935th CLA Voices, or in the speeches about the changing nature of liberal education offered on the occasion of the dedication of Johnston Hall, April 1921, 1951. Quote, "When the world is split into two hostile armed camps, liberal education must make us aware both of the idea and the practice of freedom." End quote. These remarks coincided with the rise of the progressive movement in American politics, the Cold War, and what was interpreted as a sense of emergency and a massive threat to the free world, the consensus school, the New Left, the Civil Rights Movement, and America's involvement in the morays of the Vietnam War. The echoes of these political and academic disputes reverberate in time present. Time present. In 2003, Dean Stephen Rosenstone published The Idea of University in a collection of essays entitled The Public Research University, Serving the Public Good in New Times. The essay began with Rosenstone's assessment of the situation. Quote, "As the technology revolution and new economy have gathered momentum, public support for higher education has waned, and legislature has placed public institutions of higher education under increasingly intense scrutiny," end quote. He contended that we had lost touch with some of the fundamental principles and values that had governed the development and success of our great universities. Nay, more than that. We were, in his words, courting a kind of intellectual impoverishment that could imperil higher education for years to come. As the educator and the leader of CLA, Rosenstone sought to bring the idea of university back into focus by drawing attention to the core defining characteristics, chief purposes, and primary responsibilities of university. 1, the advancement of knowledge through basic research and creative works. 2, the extension of knowledge through liberal education that enables students to think creatively and with a broad understanding of the ideas that shape the physical, social, cultural, economic, and political worlds in which they live. 3, the dissemination of knowledge through publication and civic education. Despite the familiar ring, these principles were not always reflected in the priorities that universities portrayed to legislators, business and civic leaders, their alumni, or the public. Over the past few decades, many public universities had shifted their priorities away from basic to applied research and from liberal education towards vocational training, increasingly portrayed themselves as a vehicle for economic growth and workforce development. However, as he notes, quote, "We have confused these byproducts of the university, economic and workforce development, with the core purpose of a university. Economic and workforce development are byproducts of universities excelling at what they do best: basic research, liberal education, and the dissemination of knowledge," end quote. Rosenstone, well versed in the internal and external forces that have steered university priorities away from its mission, or how the university has miseducated the public about the idea of university, proposed a vision that articulated the core characteristics of a university. It is worth reminding us what this vision was in 2003. Quote, "A university is a place where the professors engaged in research and creative work transmit their knowledge, understanding, and creativity to the students. The goal of a university education is not to provide students with a specialized set of skills, but with a liberal education, one that enables students to think critically and creatively, that provides students an understanding of the core ideas that shape the physical, social, cultural, economic, and political world in which they live. Liberal education is more than general education, more than cultural enrichment. It is an education designed to enhance the powers of the mind," end quote. The visionary program ends with a call to arms. Rosenstone invited the faculty to participate in the creation of a 5-year strategic plan, which would be a blueprint for enhancing the excellence of our college and university. We, the faculty, were asked to imagine breaking down the barriers. Imagine we break down barriers between teaching and research, barriers between teachers and researchers, between teachers and learners, barriers between learning and discovery within the university and beyond its walls, the barriers that divide one discipline from another, end quote. And imagine we did. Recall cluster diversity hires or the arts quarter. For a brief moment, everything seemed to be possible. With the completion of the new art building in June 2003, the Arts Quarter became a reality. With the new art building, all the arts at the University of Minnesota, theater housed in Rarick Center, dance in the Barbara Barker Dance Center, and music in Ferguson Hall and Ted Mann Concert Hall were brought together to create a center for teaching, creative scholarship, and performance. We began as a vision to improve teaching facilities and enhance student learning had led to a more fundamental and dramatic transformation. What united these buildings and the programs they housed was an overarching vision that gave the Arts Quarter not only a geographic identity, but a sense of shared intellectual and creative purpose. The Arts Quarter was not just about building or space. It was a powerful vehicle to transform the arts at the university and beyond, to revolutionize the educational experience by forging a new concept of arts education that helps students explore critically the creative process at the edges and intersection of the disciplines. Forge an intellectual agenda that will underlie the scholarly and creative endeavors among our faculty and students. Increase the visibility of the Arts Quarter to ensure greater outreach to the community, and to reshape how our colleagues in the CLA and beyond think about the arts and the university. In a brief time, West Bank Arts Quarter programming was created, which would be a testimony to a transformative power of liberal education. Recall the following events: Arts as Commitment, Arts as Knowing Symposia, exploring the nature of collaboration between the arts, the lecture series in dance, arts, music, and theater, supporting new modes of artistic expression, Artsmosis and the Spark Festival, relationship with the local arts organization, SPCO, Minnesota Orchestra, and the Guthrie, the creation of the BFA actor training program in collaboration with the Guthrie, the innovative program with an employment of the members of the Center for Creative Research in New York, the diversity cluster hire. Today, the tattered banners on the West Bank remind us of that vision. The economic upheaval in the fall of 2008 brought about the need to reassess the status of the strategic plan. With a diminished state support and the university's reductions, cuts, and freezes, CLA could no longer authorize 42 searches as initially planned in the summer of 2008. Dean James Parente focused on CLA's accomplishments, which are worth celebrating in 2018. We were delighted to learn this summer of the appointment of 3 CLA faculty to Regents professorships: Steve Ruggles, History; Eric Shepard, Geography; Madelon Sprengnether, English, who join our current roster of 27 Regents professors, 11 of whom are now members of CLA. This past year, one of our most distinguished economists, Professor Emeritus Leo Hurwicz, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his earlier work on mechanism design. Other colleagues continue to receive fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and other internationally renowned institutions. An austere economic environment prompted a reassessment of education in CLA, however. Parente notes, quote, "For many years, the operations of this college, its hiring of faculty and staff, its support of research, its support of graduate and undergraduate programs has been funded in large measure not on dollars received from the state, but on undergraduate tuition. Currently, about 70%, says Parente, of our operations is funded by tuition dollars, 62 of which comes from the undergraduates," end quote. Given our dependence on undergraduate tuition, we have an obligation to provide our undergraduates with an outstanding educational experience. In order to accomplish this, a faculty committee was charged to explore the ways in which the value of liberal arts education could be made more apparent and discuss ways in which a liberal arts education in CLA and in Minnesota could be regarded as a unique undergraduate experience compared to our peer public institutions. Under collegiate leadership, the focus on undergraduate education brought about, as noted in the State of the College Address from 2012, such initiatives as first-year experience and the idea of undergraduate pathways, that is, clear pathways for undergraduate students to acquire the necessary skills and plan for a range of careers. Quote, "Equally important, as announced in 2009 State of the College Address, quote, so in the face of an austere economic environment, what are our ambitions for the year ahead? What do we want our college to look like? What are new ideas that we wish to advance and realize? And what current practices should be changed, reduced, or eliminated? How will we need to change as a college to meet the needs of our emerging student population?" End quote. These questions will become framing devices for the CLA 2015 report submitted to the college on November 8, 2010. The CLA 2000 report spawned several conversations and debates in the college about the potential directions that could be pursued, but it also produced uncertainty and anxiety about the way in which that should be implemented. Several faculties centered around critical humanities challenge the emphasis on distinction, signature programs, and efficiency with the looming suggestion of restructuring and downsizing, while others found such categories essential to moving forward. To address these concerns, Parenti convened a faculty committee, many of whom were the members of critical humanities: Timothy Brennan, Juliette Cheboulier, Anna Paula Ferreira, Nanette Hanks, Rambert Heuser, Jason McGruth, John Mowat, Paula Rabinowitz, J.B. Shank, to work together on crafting a plan for strengthening the humanities, especially in the area of the comparative study of literature, culture, and media, and for reinvigorating and reimagining undergraduate and graduate education in those fields. The outcome of these deliberations was a report which put forth the idea of a humanistic commons. Quote, "Today, in the urban centers of West and North, one hears much about the crisis of the university. Despite the inflated language of crisis, what seems clear is that both financially and ideologically, the crisis of the university in general has displaced the routinely decried crisis of the humanities. This expansion across the entire domain of higher education draws attention to the important convergence of these institutions and ensembles of knowledge recognized to have played a founding role in the history of the institution. In effect, the long recognized precariousness of the humanities has now been transferred to the university itself. At this moment of urgency, at once desperate but also fecund, those working in universities are compelled by the current financial and intellectual conjuncture to rethink, even to rework, the research university as an institution and to push it beyond the impasses of its crippling funding models and the lack of political will to preserve its historical contributions to what was once called the general intellect. At Minnesota, these broad socio-historical concerns have assumed a distinctly local profile and invite particular strategies of innovation. To express in our research and teaching the unique historical and structural character of CLA and facilitate the enormous cross-disciplinary scholarship already underway here, we are calling for the formation of a humanistic commons of the liberal arts, an initiative that promises in distinctive ways to reanimate the liberal arts both within the college and across the university as a whole. We see a humanistic commons as a mode of inquiry into the humanities, a critical space that underscores the double sense of critical as both crucial and contestatory. Embracing a history of critique, it is at once central to a university and in terms of questioning its promises. Committed at once to the preservation and innovation central to the humanities, this initiative is neither a new program nor a new school, but an overarching method connecting research and teaching, end quote. Some of these critical and transformative ideas did indeed materialize in the courses uniquely designed and offered under the rubric of the Humanistic Commons freshman seminars, exploring such transdisciplinary concepts as affect, environment, time, space, image, text, movement, sound, media, music, thought, gesture, before the project receded into immemorial past. Here are their titles: Media, Music, and Movement in Pop Culture, Catherine Squires and Cindy Garcia. Stories, Bodies, Border Crossing, D.L. Arasati, Richa Nagar. Living or Dead, The Performance of Things, Jenny Skandura, Margaret Wary. The Human as a Writer, Trace Memory Self, Andy Galea, M.J. Maines, Tom Wolfe, Matt Carlson. Nature and Society in the Anthropocene, Kay Derrickson, Charlotte Mellin, Kaylee Cost. Will we continue along these lines, or are the existing disciplinary and institutional boundaries impermeable enough to repel alternatives under the veil of streamlining educational activities? In fall 2013, Raymond Bad-Dival, in his role as an interim dean, was charged with two tasks, one financial, one academic. To manage a structural deficit, one of the obvious strategies is retention of undergraduate students by fostering more vibrant forms of what the 2015 report calls a student-centric curriculum. Feasible steps were outlined, telling the liberal arts story, adapting to changing student interests, doing the little things which are big things for the students, online summer offerings, interdisciplinary innovation, undergraduate recruitment. To address the academic task, Dival proposed that this year we would give concrete substance to the general and abstract principles outlined in the 2015 report, which called for strategically focused investment and disinvestment, but did not specify what should be targeted for each. The emphasis was thus on some signature initiatives, which had been put forth prior to the change in CLA leadership, some of which are still in existence today. The Human Rights Academy, the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute, consolidating the cognitive and behavioral sciences, the Consortium on the Pre-Modern World, and fostering deeper integration of the statistics department with the quantitative social sciences. The arrival of Dean John Coleman in the fall of 2014 marked the end of the transitional year. His State of the College address outlined the direction for CLA, the road ahead, was signposted by three general areas of commitment. First, quote, "We have a relentless focus on research and creative excellence across the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Second, I consider it an obligation and an imperative that we enrich and enhance the student experience. Third, we will energetically pursue more communication and strength, engagement and partnership and development. Alumni and donors have echoed what I have repeatedly heard from faculty and staff. We in CLA have not been doing a good job of communicating the great things we are doing, either to our colleagues on campus or the constituencies off campus," end quote. These three areas will become the framing device of the roadmap for CLA to become a destination college. The investment is in four key areas: preparing the most desirable candidates for the job market. CLA launches Career Readiness Initiative, using CLA discoveries to build brighter futures for all of us. Commons for Research in the Social Sciences, Institute for Research and Statistics and its applications, Environmental Humanities Initiative, a new program in Islamic Studies, interdisciplinary collaborative workshop program. Building bridges between campus and community, community-based initiatives, the Resilient Communities Project, CLA Emerging Alumni Award, and engaging every voice in a drive to discover through inclusiveness, access, and diversity. Summer funding for DAF Fellowship recipients was increased, and the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality, otherwise known as RIGS initiative. CLA and the study of the humanities, fine arts, and social sciences indeed launch students into advanced work within their degree programs, as well as help them articulate the grounds upon which differences are and have been historically articulated between languages, literatures, cultures, and media, between forms of life and social formations, and between the disciplines, ideas, and practices. Help them study and question the beliefs and opinions that maintain such differences. What animates this project is the conviction so cogently expressed in the humanistic commons narrative that humanistic inquiry is central to the intellectual and socio-historical project of this university. This academic intellectual framework must not be reduced to or confused with byproducts of a university or new skill acquisition as defined today by the CLA Career Readiness Project, which bridges academic and professional life by employing a recognizable set of epistemological categories: analytical and critical thinking, applied problem solving, ethical reasoning, innovation and creativity, career management, understanding diversity, community engagement, and teamwork, oral and written communication. This pairing, academic, intellectual framework, and new skill acquisitions can be useful if it leads to a critique of conformist logic promoting that which is, or compromised if it ends up being part of instrumental approach to education, where the established system determines students' needs, their choices, and their opinions, as revealed, for example, by the current brewing controversy over the CLE requirements. The next CLA anniversary may show if indeed career readiness led to a critique of an instrumental approach to education. In the meantime, let me repeat that the tension between what we teach and new skill acquisition should be a critique of a given state of educational affairs. Nay, it should draw attention to a critique of the given state of educational affairs on their own ground, on that which is immediately before us. Time future. Educated hope. Time past and time present draw attention to the fact that the very institutional framework of our intellectual and pedagogical activities has been the object of considerable critical reflection. This reflection has turned to everything from the role of philosophy in high school curricula and the popular pedagogy of mass culture, to the socio-political function of the contemporary university in the era of globalization. An important early intervention was that of Bill Reddings, who in the University of Ruins, 1996, asks us to think twice about what we called the University of Excellence. With this phrase, Reddings offers a critique of the very notion of excellence on which so much of our institutional emphasis is placed. And whether one agrees with his vision or not, the challenge he issued is unmistakable. The University of Excellence is the corporate university, that is, the university where largely empty categories such as excellence are used to describe and evaluate performance in accord with largely economic matrices, desirable attributes, and standards. Dangerous here is not the becoming corporate university. We already are. Rather, what is dangerous is the way excellence answers preemptively all questions about the purpose of higher education, not only by actually addressing them in any detail, but by framing all possible answers in a way that rationalizes the application of economic matrices and standards themselves. We're always already striving to be excellent without taking stock of the more fundamental question. What does it mean to be excellent? And perhaps even more fundamental, what is education today? It is not to prepare one for what there is, but to make one hunger for and strive to imagine and thereby bring to life in us that which does not exist yet. To describe the benefits of education in terms of how it better prepares students for the ever-changing market is already accept, even endorse, the notion that education is essentially about training rather than learning. If only for a moment, I wish for a halt to these trends, so that we can re-examine the ideal of education and recognize that its practice is not merely a logical, epistemological, or performative problem, but rather that education is anchored within our social structures and consequently situated within specific historical possibilities. Given this perspective, how do we think of education, the arts, literature, and social sciences as it's related to CLA's actual operations in 2018? Does it function as a praxis which reveals uncompromisingly the tension that exists between it and the pressures of a conformist logic that requires unrestricted submission to economic demands and its operational thought? Or does it function as a vehicle of adjustment which uses its concepts, its methods, its technology to restrict their experience of students in the administered academic world? Let me ask, how can education be grasped and articulated in the current disquiet? I offer these thoughts for the 150th anniversary of the College of Liberal Arts. Let me end by turning to the words of the interwar German philosopher Ernst Bloch, who in his inaugural address at the University of Tübingen in 1961 proposed a distinction between hope, which fixes upon narrow issues, or public activism that runs blindly after narrow-minded utopian escapist hope, and the very different principle embedded by the Latin phrase docta spes, educated hope. The project of educated hope involves taking the risk of challenging people to question their convictions in order to arrive at others. It doesn't make peace with the existing world. Quote, therefore, hope must be unconditionally disappointable. First, because it's open in a forward direction, in a future-oriented direction. It doesn't address itself to that which already exists. Second, hope must be disappointable because even when concretely mediated, it can never be mediated by solid facts. For these are always, in the face of what informs hope, merely subjectively reified moments or objectively reified stoppages within a historical course of events. End quote. Educated hope is committed to radical transformation, which is grounded in historical process, the world process. It doesn't surrender when setback occur. With a renegade spirit, it gambles on whatever has been negated up to now. It becomes wiser through injury and attention to the tendency in which the so-called facts are circulating and developing. Educated hope is an act of going beyond into the region of the not yet, the undifferentiated realm of potentiality. Educated hope thinks its own history, the past, but it does so in order to free itself from what it thinks, the present, and be able to think otherwise, the future. Time past, time present, time future. A call to the CLA faculty. Without this critique of experience, the students are deprived of the intellectual methods and tools which would enable them to comprehend and evaluate their society and its culture as a whole. In the historical continuum in which this society fulfills, distorts, or denies its own possibilities and promises. Instead, the students are trained for comprehending and evaluating the established conditions and possibilities only in terms of the established conditions and possibilities. Their thinking, their ideas, their goals are programmatically and scientifically restricted, not by logic, experience, facts, but by a purged logic, a mutilated experience, incomplete facts, end quote. Educated hope, a critique of the established state of affairs which denies its own promises and potentialities. Educated hope, a critique of the established state of affairs which reveals the possible alternatives beyond the status quo. Educated hope. Thank you.